Where's the Monk rework? Rogue has one, Demon Hunter's getting one too, and yet Monk still struggles with button bloat on Brewmaster, playstyle issues with Mistweaver, and if you think those need fixing, we haven't even touched Windwalker's AoE and auto attack situation. And we will touch that, haha. And on what can actually be done to solve this issue with a rework. Windwalker is probably the one that feels the weirdest out of all of the Monk specs, although Brewmaster isn't far off. Let's start with the Mastery, which affects what the general public has come to know as Windwalker scaling during an expansion. The Mastery, however unique, is actually very weak. The damage boost it provides is not sufficient to warrant looking for it on gear. It doesn't affect all the abilities Windwalker has, which is the first problem. It doesn't affect auto attacks, which is another thing we will talk about in a second. And lastly, there are way too many external power sources that work off of crit and versatility, which Windwalker tends to naturally gravitate towards, that just make Mastery almost dead. Since Mastery is weak to begin with, you will take less of it, and because Haste has minimal to no applications for Windwalker, being weaker than Mastery actually, you will want crit and verse as a byproduct, and because there are trinkets like Beacon of the Beyond, weapons with procs, sets with procs that all scale with versatility and are often influenced by your crit chance to actually crit, it doubles down on the whole Mastery is poop issue. Fixing the issue with Mastery to affect more abilities, to maybe affect auto attacks as well, will make Windwalker not fall off during an expansion outside getting broken mechanics, bugs, or tuning like it had in Shadowlands. And auto attacks are the second big problem. Currently, you do not auto attack when you channel Fists of Fury and Spinning Crane Kick. I think not being able to auto attack as a melee DPS and a monk that relies on punching is stupid. But if you think you shouldn't be able to auto attack during channels, that's not really stupid. Both points can be valid, and hey, Arms Warrior still auto attacks while blade storming. Why can't Windwalker do the same? However, if we are going to live in a world where auto-attacking stops because of fists or spins, then that has to be compensated somehow. Babylonius, the big daddy Windwalker theory crafter and admin of the Peak of Serenity community, suggested something neat, where both Fists of Fury and Spinning Crane Kick can instead become buffs on you for their duration, and instead make it so auto-attacking does essentially what the spells do, with Fists of Fury making your auto-attacks hit targets in a cone in front with more damage on your main target, and Crane making your autos kick around you in an 8-yard AoE fashion with all the side passives and procs that would normally affect both of these abilities. Then you can even have Mastery buff these by a percentage or a scaling flat amount of any kind, making autos first of all relevant and making scaling better throughout the lifespan of an expansion. Not to mention that this can fix the auto attacks issue that the current and future tier set seems to want to be designed around but cannot properly function because auto attacks are a problem. And as a proof of that, the recently changed tier set for Windwalker is set to affect all of the melee abilities, not just auto attacks, just to further nail down the issue that auto attacks and essentially by byproduct Mastery is kind of a problem. The design of these can go in other directions as well, and could fit the fantasy of Windwalker even more, since it makes sense for a martial artist to have strong and important hits throughout the fight that in a video game are essentially auto attacks. There are also two big abilities that create a bunch of gameplay problems. First of all, Feline Stomp forces you to stay in its ground effect, get the reset mechanic. This, for the most mobile melee spec in the game, feels incredibly counterintuitive, and even more than that, it's an incredible, annoying, and antiquated mechanic that I am hard pressed to find any person legitimately liking it. No spec so far enjoyed being forced to base its damage on stationary ground effect, let alone being forced to stay in a ground effect to do damage. Mages complained about Rune of Power for years and it was removed, and they were range casters that could hit stuff from their rune. If shit walks away from your Feline, then bye-bye damage as a melee DPS. A good community suggested change was to make the Feline actually be a debuff on the target that carries the effect with the target and is not fixed to a position on the floor. That would make it feel better in terms of playstyle. But I understand if the fantasy of the Stomp was important, and fantasy is important to Blizzard, that's why we have Tauren mages and rogues. So instead, you can make the ground effect larger, at least when it comes to buffing you. That way, the margin of error is larger and causes less arbitrary friction. The other big ability that needs a rework is Touch of Death. Dragonflight introduced, albeit a pretty fun take on the ability, making it cleave in AoE, but it seems to have created way more issues. Having it be a primary, if not the best damage source in your kit over the course of a fight, while also being a 1 or 2 button press is bad. It makes you feel like working with combo strikes, maintaining buffs, proccing abilities feels stupid when one button can top all of that. Another issue with it ties in with the scaling problem I mentioned mentioned before. Touch of Death scales with versatility, once again making sure you will never gear mastery. Reworking this into being something like Executioner's Sentence for Red Paladin, something it used to do in the past, can solve this issue and also make it more interactive and engaging. Addressing it this way can also fix the skewed power in the talents, where it's more beneficial to talent into Touch of Death and Fatal Flying Guillotine all scenarios than other sources of AoE, some which are part of a list of talents that Windwalkers simply never use. Rushing Jadewind is one of the biggest offenders. It's horrible for Brewmasters, it's even worse for Windwalkers. I am not sure who is so emotionally attached to this ability, where it seems to be shoved down our throats consistently, but it either has to go or rework. Currently, it does the most vanilla thing ever. Very little AoE damage around you, soft cap at 5 targets. At least make it uncapped AoE, or merge it with Spinning Crane Kick to solve the auto attacks issue I mentioned before. Bam! Problem solved. And there are a lot of other talents that you see on the screen right now that are either never used, have very low impact, are forcing us to take them to get to where we want to, or monks simply don't like them, period. This alone accumulates to a big number of reasons why Windwalker should be changed, and we haven't even touched the class tree. That's a bit more difficult to approach since each spec uses it differently, but on the topic of Windwalker, one suggested change by the monks is to have the White Tiger statue be made into a utility node, similar to Windfury Totem for Enhancement Shaman. Although Monk already brings a raid buff, personally I think the design of White Tiger statue is still lazy, and it has been my point ever since it was added into the beta. It's a bland, rushing Jadewind mechanic at a location for 30 seconds with 2 minutes cooldown. It's boring, doesn't interact with any part of your spec as Windwalker, and has no business being a capstone. Mistweaver is an example of a rework happening without a rework happening, if that makes sense. Throughout Dragonflight, starting with the beta, Mistweaver has had multiple changes across the board to slowly but surely make it better and better in terms of playstyle. More recently, the talents around mana regen have been improved to more accurately reflect a Mists of Pandaria / Warlords of Draenor design, and with the general talent design and power distribution, the spec focuses a lot on spreading renewing mists as much as possible, which is a fun and rewarding gameplay, and this is further taken into what Mistweavers today call ramping, similar to what Disciplined Priests and Resto Druids have, where you build up more and more renewing mists on your raid, since in Mythic Plus would be easier with fewer targets, and then go into a full-on blast healing mode to blanket the group in Vivifies and enveloping mists with Invoke Yu'lon. There are, however, a few things that need to be changed to bring Mistweaver in line to kinda how Holy Paladin is, or wants to be, and in the process making it more accessible to new healers as well, since the spec is still criminally underplayed, and we would like to thank Anomaly for putting some light on the matter and clarifying the spec for us with some much needed knowledge. Lately, Clouded Focus has been the playstyle together with Dancing Mists, which created two problems at the same time that once again don't match up to modern WoW design. Clouded Focus is kind of what you would be doing at the end of a ramp. Once you have enough renewing mists up, you go into a Soothing Mist and spam Vivifies for that cleave healing at reduced mana cost and increased healing efficiency. This essentially forces you to plant your feet for the entire duration of the channel, or as much of it as possible, seeing as how you want to build the 3 stacks for maximum effort and not waste them by cancelling the channel, which you will often have to do to dodge mechanics, move from A to B, or simply reposition. This style of play hurts most casters and not just healers, and is one of the least fun moments of being a caster. I'm not saying we shouldn't have hard casting moments, but they should feel like we are working with the mechanics of the fight and not them working against us just to arbitrarily cause friction once again. The second issue is how you get to that ramp, and that's by no small contribution with Dancing Mists spreading renewing mists with a proc chance, which is a concept that should never be applied to healers or tanks. Rarely has survivability been tied to a proc chance mechanic and felt good, and definitely never reliable. Survivability is something you manage, plan, and execute efficiently at a very specific time. There isn't a large window for room of error where it feels good to base your and your group's survivability on a proc chance, no matter the size. And lastly, something that people might have not had to deal with for a while, Ancient Teachings and Essence Font. There are people, myself included, that are not fans of Essence Font. Essence Font has been only okay, maybe even cool when it worked on its own 2 feet, and definitely not tied to Ancient Teachings. Weaving this in to activate melee damage window always felt stupid ever since Shadowlands introduced the mechanic. Essence Font is also weird by itself when added to the Mistweaver kit. It's another channel that spreads mini hots that actively takes you away from your main playstyle of maintaining and spreading renewing mists. A disconnect from the gameplay, if you will. It looked cool to move around and fire healing bolts. That mechanic is dope. Maybe it should be made a cooldown with some passives worked into it to maybe give damage reduction, cleanse some debuffs, or or reduce cooldowns of some of your stuff, or extend active renewing mists, or anything like that. That way, it would feel more impactful as a playstyle and not as bad as to break away from fist weaving or generally healing other peeps with maybe clouded focus. Brewmaster has a few similar issues with both other specs. Right now, the talent diversity seems to be lower even than both Windwalker and Mistweaver, where the talent setup is universal regardless of content, with only 2 to 3 changes from last season, which consist of mostly choice node talents you are already in. All of this brings about a plethora of unused talents that should be addressed either in buffs or reworks. The button bloat issue is, however, the most prominent on Brewmaster out of all the other specs in the game. The sheer amount of abilities you cycle through in a regular encounter would make Mozart enjoyers shift uncomfortably in their chair. Once again, one of the biggest offender remains to this day rushing Jade Wind, which in this case you do take. The DPS increase is very useful, and the fact that it's passive helps it a lot. It doesn't make it any more interesting, and similar to Windwalker, it's incredibly boring with no interaction with your spec. Stagger also needs to be addressed. Firstly, Shuffle is an uninteresting mitigation mechanic due to how easy and forgettable it is when it comes to having it up. There is little to no decision making in interacting with this passive except the active decision to not have it up by deliberately ignoring your basic abilities. It is not an easy mitigation to balance, sure, but there has to be more agency with interacting with it. Currently, there is a lot of emphasis put on optimizing DPS output since there is literally nothing tank-wise to optimize except pressing Purify Brew when on max charges and Celestial Brew when available. Don't get me wrong, the current playstyle is fun, but it feels more like a DPS that happens to have the tank role, and the meters reflect this as well. Brewmaster has always been tricky to design because one wrong step and it could completely dominate the tank meta due to how efficient Stagger is as a mitigation mechanic. Be that as it may, the potential to make it interesting is there, and although all tanks share this to some extent, Brew has the most interesting way it can interact with incoming damage that should be baked into the talents, and not having most of that or having it so undertuned that it doesn't really matter is just a shame. And these changes for Monk are not impossible. We are already seeing them being applied to other classes, like the most recent Rogue reworks that hit the class with Subtlety being particularly juicy, since a lot of the stuff that it got, from shifting around dead or bad talents to giving cooldowns more power, are something that monks can take a lesson from, and you can check our video on the Subtlety rework right here.